Oh, there are
So,
ladies everywhere.
welcome everybody to our Beit Midrash from Congregation Ephraim, where we're going to be learning today about some Jewish perspectives on abortion. And for those joining us right now, I'm posting here on the chat the PDF that we're going to be using in our learning. And if you are listening to this as a recording, look at the description of this video, and you're going to get the link to the source sheet there as well. So before we even get to most of our sources and everything, I just want to share that the verse I chose to really be a mantra for thinking about this topic and maybe many others that we'll learn together comes from the book of Devarim, from the very end of the Torah, Parshat Nitzavim. And it says that God sets up on this day before us life and death, blessing and curse, and we have free will to make that choice, but still we're commanded to choose life. So wherever we are on that discussion, we're always choosing life. And that's not always a clear-cut decision. This is not necessarily an easy decision, but this is the framework, this is the perspective with which we approach any topic, and this topic in particular. I saw some people also joining us. I'm posting again. I don't know if the chat stays for people who join later, so I'm posting again here on the chat the PDF that we are looking at today. So before you look into anything, where does in the Torah it says anything about abortion? Yes, Sylvia, you're muted. You're muted, Sylvia.
I don't remember what book it's in, but there's a story or a provision about having an argument with someone, and the woman standing next to where the argument is taking place is pregnant, and if she loses the child, I lost my whole system, but I'm sure you know the reference I'm talking about.
I know
that there was no liability.
That's source number one in our source sheet, but that doesn't talk about abortion. Well, it talks about a woman who is hit, and based on the hit by another person, that she's not even part of the conversation, it's an accident, right? She loses her pregnancy. Is that abortion?
Well, some people think it is.
So the question is, where does the Torah talk about abortion? Nate has his hands up.
I would take a guess that nowhere, because they didn't have that kind of technology back then. We would talk about miscarriages or maybe someone being injured and killing what was inside, but in terms of it was an unknown concept to our ancestors back then.
Yes, Ken.
I was just going to venture a guess, as much as I would hate to disagree with Nate, that it probably was a known concept back then, because women have been dealing with pregnancies and the unwanted ones for thousands of years, and I would guess it probably was an issue back then.
So as the classic Fiddler in the Roof would say, both of you are right. Where Nate, you're right in the sense that nowhere in the Torah it explicitly talks about abortion. We're gonna see that by the time of the Talmud already, it's more clear that they're talking about some of those procedures, as Ken mentioned. The time of the Torah is unclear. Since it doesn't talk about it, we need to look to references on other texts from the similar time. If they knew some kind of procedure, is not clear to us in that sense. I think that Marty has also something to share.
Just wanted to insert, since there is a prohibition about contraception, would that follow that if you can't spill your sperm, that it would make it even worse to abort.
So Marty is bringing two things there. One is contraception, and one is if there is sperm that is not used, and those are not necessarily the same thing. So there is something called Ashpat Zera, is I think at the very last page of our document might have thing there, or no, I didn't include that. No, I didn't include that table. So yeah, so semen that is not used for the sake of procreation, the Torah has a condemnation about that, and usually on the end of the male partner of that interaction, that he can have sexual intercourse and then ejaculate outside. That's the major concern of that. But prohibitions about contraception and permissions about contraception are going to be later on discussed by rabbis. There's not anything that clear as what we now know as contraception. There is a little text at the very end that include about contraception. But again, this is not talking about abortion. This is somehow hinting on the topic. So that's the first learning that I want us to have for today. Anything that is written in the Torah is the beginning of our conversation, never the end. So if anyone says, but it's written in the Torah that, you know that that's a great beginning for us to have an amazing conversation. But it can never be the end of a conversation that something is written in the Torah, because that's not the Jewish method of approaching any issue. If something is written in the Torah, therefore we discuss it for 3,000 years. That's our tradition, right? We don't just end the conversation because it's written in the Torah. While in Talmudic debates, the argument of a pasuk, of a verse, in some instances, can be used as a final argument. It's only used as a final argument when the people discussing understand that as a final argument, but there was a discussion about that. So there is a method of using a verse on the Torah as the end of a conversation in the Talmud in some places. And many places, when you throw a verse, the other rabbis say, well, but what about this verse? What about this concept? What about this value, right? So the only thing we know is if something is written in the Torah, we're going to have a 16-page long source sheet to debate about. And I swear I had to filter down the sources. There's so much more for us to look at. And today we're just going to have a glimpse into some of the things that I consider most important. So let's look at that verse that Sylvia mentioned earlier. Those are sources 1, 2, and 3 on our source sheet. And you're going to see that we might have an issue of translation there. The verse says that when two are fighting and one of them pushes a pregnant woman and a miscarriage results, but no other damages happen, meaning to the fetus. I think that's the implicit part in there, but otherwise it wouldn't make sense to mention pregnant woman. The one responsible shall be fined according as the woman's husband may exact from him. The payment to be on reckoning. So I cut from the translation the next verses that I kept in Hebrew. But they are very known, which are going to be nefesh tachat nefesh, ayin tachat ayin, a life for a life, an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, and so on and on and on. That the rabbis later on are going to understand that as not as a ritual, real life for life, but a fine, a payment that values a life. And they have a whole procedure on how to measure how that damage that was caused and how this will be compensating by money. So this is the big picture of what we're looking like, and a lot of the things we're going to be discussing come out from this. The major takeaway from this text, from most of the Jewish sources, is the following. If there is no damage to the fetus, just the woman is hurt. Let me look closer, because that's the translation problem that I don't want to get into. So if she is killed, the punishment is life for life. If she sorry, here the picture is she has a miscarriage, right? This is the topic where she has a miscarriage. So the fetus for sure dies in that occasion. The thing is, if she dies or not. If she dies, life for life, right? So this is punishment to the extremist degree, because you killed a person, therefore you must be killed, or later on the rabbis are going to create a fine that replaces that. If she is not killed, the woman survives, but still has a miscarriage, the person is only liable for a fine. So the major takeaway that the rabbis are going to have for that is the life of the fetus does not value as much as the life of the mother. Because the life of the mother is, the punishment is life for life. The miscarriage is a monetary fine from the outset. So there is a distinction. That's the major takeaway that our rabbis are going to take from that. Then we're going to have an issue with the translation of this text in the Septuagint. Septuagint is the most famous Greek translation that happened about 2,000 years ago. And this is an English translation from the Greek. And the word ason, that is in the middle of the first line in the Hebrew, that in the first translation from JPS and most Jewish sources is translated as damage, is translated differently by the Septuagint. Here, two men are fighting, strike a pregnant woman, and her child comes forth not fully formed. Not fully formed. That's how they're translating ason. I knew that Andy was going to be here, and I did have the Greek translation for that, and I forgot. But they go with something with the word icon, which has to do with really icon, as we know, like, which has to do with form. Makes sense, Andy? So this is very important because the Latin translation of the Bible, that is going to be very important for Christians, translates mostly from the Septuagint. They do not translate the Bible directly from the Hebrew. Rather, they translate from the Greek, which is what they knew. So a lot of issues we're going to have that Christians have a different take on something that is from the Hebrew Bible, or as they call it, the Old Testament, has to do with translation into the Septuagint, and then from the Septuagint to the Latin version that would get started with the Christian church. Any questions or comments so far? So just an addendum on that idea. What's the challenge of that translation? The child comes forth not fully formed. This is where we're going to get a lot of discussions nowadays, where the time of the pregnancy matters from a Christian perspective. Because there is an understanding that at some point, still in the womb, the fetus is completely formed. Therefore, there is a life. Therefore, this is killing. And that's their major argument. So here on the translation, we see a little bit of this issue. Judaism still is going to discuss a lot about the times throughout the pregnancy. There are differences also in the Jewish debate about that, but this is not the source for that necessarily. Here I just brought number 3 is the explanation from the Talmud about this verse, and explaining a little bit about what we just did now. You're gonna, I did bring here the Greek version in the commentary of Rabbi Danya Rutenberg. So in the beginning of page 2, you're gonna see that many of the sources on this source sheet, and for those who join later, I don't know if I have access to the chat, so I'm posting again on the chat the PDF that we're looking at. We're in the beginning of page 2. Rabbi Danya Rutenberg is the scholar in residence for the National Council of Jewish Women, and she has been doing a lot of great work in educating our community about this topic. So some of those sources, she had notes about it that I included here that helps us understand a little bit more. So here she explains a little bit better about the challenge with the translation that I just mentioned. So that brings up the second question for us about that, and especially in the distinction between Christian and Jewish approaches to that, which is, when is a soul born? Soul in Hebrew many times is gonna be called nefesh. Whenever we're talking about the most initial form of life, neshama or ruach can also be used, but they are more metaphorical senses about other things. But nefesh is also translated as life, soul in the sense of life. So when does a person have a nefesh? When there is a life. And here the source number 4 is a very interesting Jewish text that actually is not the mainstream, but I wanted to bring also other perspectives on that meaning, even that is not going to be formed into halakha later, because as I mentioned in the beginning, if it's something is written in the Torah, this is just the beginning of our conversation, and we can discuss that until the Jewish community comes together through some methods that we can talk about that later, to some conclusions here and there. And sometimes those conclusions are diametrical opposites from each other, and that's also totally fine. That's part of what it means to be Jewish. So this quick story of the Talmud is talking about Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, and he was asked, from when is the soul placed in a person? Is it the moment of conception, or the moment of formation of the embryo, or 40 days after the conception? There are so many options there. And Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, who was the leader of his generation around the year 200, said to Antoninus that for the moment of formation of the embryo. And Antoninus said to him, "This is crazy, I cannot believe that." And he uses this interesting expression: is it possible that a piece of meat could stand for even 3 days without salt as a preservative and would not rot? Right? So imagine their world, meat needed to be preserved in salt. How can that be that for a while there is this piece of meat without a soul? Because the soul here is being like the salt is what preserves the material piece of life. So rather, he says the soul is placed from the moment of conception. And Rabbi Yehuda Nasi says, Antoninus taught me this matter, and there is a verse that supports him. As it says in the book of Job, and your providence has preserved my spirit, right? The providence preserved the spirit, indicating that is creating the moment of conception that the soul is preserved within a person. So look at that. There is a story, not by a random person, but Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, that has this perception. And this perception will be shared by other religions as well. And I love bringing the multitude of opinions and how subsequent generations are gonna look into it. So from a very similar source, also the Talmud, we have text number 5 that is going to say, if she's found pregnant until the 40th day, my be'alma is mere fluid. It's just like water. So from the same Talmud that just said that there is soul from the moment of conception, we have the idea that the 40 days, this is just fluid. It's just water, no soul in there. So that debate existed, was alive, and maybe still is. And I want to read Rabbi Daniel Rutenberg's note on this debate, on those two issues. That is to say that the fetus has basically no status whatsoever for the 40 days of pregnancy. It is like water, a thing of no legal significance. Was this because of the prevalence of miscarriages? Was it larger philosophical claim? Regardless, this text is clear assertion that life does not begin at conception. Why is she hinting harder on the second one? Because that's what the mainstream halachic development is gonna go. That 40-day period in the very beginning is this discussion here is usually the one that really wins the debate. It may be worth noting that modern decisors of Jewish law count the 40 days as beginning from conception, from a Jewish perspective, given that contemporary medical practice is to count pregnancy, gestation from the last menstrual period, not conception. The end of those 40 days land at about 5 or 8 weeks of pregnancy by our current accounting. So we also see a discrepancy between how medical teams count things and what Jewish understanding of that at that time was about that. Questions are coming so far.
Just to be clear, so you count the 40 days starting from when the woman basically knows she's pregnant because she's missed a period? Or did I get, or is it the opposite?
Dr. Zimet will tell what's the right medical answer. Steve, when do we count officially according to medical standards?
The short answer is I don't know. Typically, the only date that is certain is the date of the last menstrual cycle. So we tend to use that as the benchmark, but because the date of conception may vary, and often the participants don't really know for sure.
So it's the last menstrual cycle that happened.
Correct,
right?
correct.
That
The
happened,
last,
not the one that she missed,
right,
the one that happened,
happened.
right? And then, so probably those 40 days after that, right, the 7 to 8 weeks is gonna be after another period was missed already. And we just heard about 3 men discussing about menstrual period, and you understand how much we know about that. Any women who had that experience want to share a little bit more of how this is counted from your perspective?
I have a question.
Yes.
So I don't know about when you count from the menstrual period or not, but I would think that the reason they would say it would be water is because what comes out of you at early pregnancies is you don't see anything except, I would ask, just tissue and blood. I would think that's what you see. And therefore, there's not a form that's come out. It's a very small, the embryo is so tiny. So there's nothing to see.
And so,
I would think.
as Rabbi Daniel Rutenberg mentioned in her comment, that there was a huge prevalence of miscarriage in that early period. So there are 2 things that we learned from that. One is that they knew what that looked like from the miscarriage process. So they might be referring to that. And the other thing that I think she's hinting on here is a practical societal decision. With the amount of miscarriages, especially on this early stage, would happen. What is the weight of the loss of the community to have to mourn for a life that often? So it's still very common in other traditions as well to have multiple and different approaches to miscarriage. But in many of them, and also in some aspects, in some places within Judaism, the best answer for miscarriage is forget it and try it again. Because we can't just linger on that world for too long, especially in a world where that has happened very often. The amount of miscarriages that we see right now and see as a tragedy is part of the beauty of medicine, that it's not that often that it happens anymore, and therefore every single one we take with a different approach to that. And I think this really changes the way we relate to this entire topic as well.
Okay.
Sylvia.
Contrary to common writings, and what people talk about, most women are not regular every 4 weeks. So trying to figure out exactly when your last menstrual period began, ended, middle, is really not easy. Although, I will say that there are times, for some reason, whether it's psychological or otherwise, a woman can tell which course of intercourse impregnated her.
Yeah.
It's not often, but it does happen. But the other, which I said is more common, most women are not every 28 days.
100%. Steve.
I just wanted to make the comment that as good as medicine is now, particularly in bringing early births, premature births to life, really, we still don't know when the baby's going to be born. You get an EDC, and that's estimated date of confinement. It's kind of an approximate date, maybe it'll be that week, et cetera, et cetera. And so nobody really knows until it's about time. So no matter as much progress as we've made, and it's been miraculous, really, there's still that big gap. So timing is tough.
I agree 100%, and that's also why we see so many discrepancies on how we count, because it's not that of a specific science on the medical side. All the more so whenever the soul comes to it as part of that process as well. So with that in mind, I want us to take us to the next tail end of that, and we're gonna start seeing some sources now that are gonna support that argument that there is a difference on the life of the woman and the life of the fetus, like we saw on that text from the Torah, that based on the punishment from the result, that they are different. We're gonna start seeing some commentaries on that, sharing how they have a different weight. So there is a discussion that Rashi is commenting on, that as the head comes out from the birth, at that moment is when they're discussing that probably there is life already, and after that moment, if someone kills the baby, that would be an actual killing. So let's read what Rashi has to say here. With a woman that has experienced difficulty giving birth, as it is in mortal danger, and it is taught in the first section of this teaching, the midwife extends her hand and cuts it up and extracts the pieces. As the entire time that there has not gone into the air of the world, it is not considered a soul, and so it is possible to kill it and to save its mother. But when the head came out, we cannot touch it to kill it, as it's like a born baby, and we do not push off one soul for the sake of another. So what Rashi is saying here is, while the head has not come off, we're not going to consider that fetus a life. And their practice at that time that he's referring to, that the Talmud has a discussion about, is that if they see a problem before that moment and they need to take the baby out, they didn't have the kind of medicine we have right now, C-section and all of that, that they'll cut the fetus in pieces and taking limb by limb out to preserve the life of the mother. This is the science of the time and the practices that they have, and that was considered permissible according to Rashi, because there is no soul yet, and the life of the mother takes precedence. And then here he hints into another phrase that we're going to see later on the real source, Ein duchin nefesh mipnei nefesh. We cannot push off one soul for the sake of another. Meaning, if we have two lives, we cannot say that we're gonna take this all over this and us make the choice when they're both real lives. While one is life and one is potential of life, this is not an equal balance equation. And then the life takes precedence over the potential of life. He's hinting to that. We're gonna see down there the sources for that. Questions or comments so far? So Rabbi Daniel Rutenberg hints here on a possibility that where Rashi is getting that from. And if there is a text on the chapter 2 of Breshit that says that about God breathed into Adam's nostrils the breath of life. So how do we say breath in Hebrew? Neshima. How we say soul in Hebrew? Neshama. We said nefesh. Nefesh is one form of soul. Neshama, another one. The Kabbalists are going to go crazy about the differences between these two. And neshama is connected through this verse. So that's probably why there is this classic understanding that once the head is out, that's when there is breath, the divine breath, imparting the soul into that baby. And here, the last source on this, like original ideas of the Talmud that I want to hint to is in that discussion we saw before about Rabbi Yehuda Anasi, about the positions and all of that. There is another discussion that he actually disagrees with that. It's very interesting that while the Talmud can disagree with each other, rabbis in the Talmud can disagree with themselves in other places, right? So this is also possible. And in this other discussion, there is a question of why he held that position. He held that because the fetus is considered like the mother's thigh. That is their way to say it's part of her body. It's attached to her. There is no individual life force, but it's something that is part of her. And this is going to be also an argument used many times, especially in the modern perspective about that the woman, the mother of the fetus, is the one who has the autonomy of making any decision, because according to this source, this is literally part of her. This is her body. And this is a religious explanation for that supports that idea. Questions are coming so far? You're all way too quiet today.
No, that the point you just made about the woman, the fetus, I would use the word many people would object to, is a parasite, has been made a lot, but nobody seems to want to acknowledge that, because especially in the early stages of pregnancy.
So
it's a very difficult idea.
I'm not gonna call it a parasite either, Sylvia, but I'm gonna give you another name that hints into that same idea from our sources in just a couple pages.
Okay.
So, Rabbi,
Yes.
don't we usually follow Rashi? Isn't he one of the most respected sages? And don't we usually follow? So if he said, he said that it's not a soul until the head is through the birth canal, correct? Is that what you're saying?
So there are two things there. Do we always follow Rashi? The difference between a religion and a cult is that the cult only follows one person.
Got it.
The religion has multiple voices, right? So yes, Rashi is one of the most important teachers, especially on interpreting the Torah for homiletical learning, right? In trying to give the real meaning of what the Torah actually wants to say, is usually just a great summarizer of great midrashim. Rashi doesn't do much about halachic ruling necessarily. Whenever he comments on the Talmud, he also has that idea of explaining what is happening. he tries to take himself a little bit away from, this is my opinion, that's what I think. He tries to explain based on his broad knowledge of the sources, what is actually happening. His grandchildren and students, the Tosafot, that lived a generation after him, many times are going to disagree with him. The Ramban, Nachmanides, is many times going to disagree with him. So yes, he's very important also because of the time where he lived, and a lot of the ones that came later had to read him because he was the major, and still is, that anyone who reads anything comes out of him. So he's part of the conversation. He's a lot of the times right, but not always.
Okay.
Yes, Nate.
Just as a follow-up of that question, correct me if I'm misinterpreting or wrong, it's been known to happen. In terms of for citing Jewish sources, you know, I see this as we don't have one final conclusive site that we use. We can't just say Rashi said so, that over time we will revise and change as we understand, as discussions occur, as we learn more about the science. As you know, like for all the sites you provide, it seems like that becomes the beginning of a discussion. But for someone to just say like it's absolutely prohibited, period, because you know holding up the Bible seems anathema to Judaism, and the discussions that you know even the Talmud is multiple perspectives.
I agree with most of it, Nate. I just want to maybe make a cut in the timeline. Holding the Bible as the source or the Talmud as the source? No, because as we said, the Bible is the beginning of a conversation, and the Talmud is known for its multiple interpretations. What we're going to see, mostly starting from the Rif, who makes a commentary on the Talmud, but mostly in the preeminence, Rambam, Maimonides, creating the first organized code of law. He wanted to take away a little bit about that pluralism, because real people cannot live with that. Real people need to wake up in the morning and know what to do. So we love to discuss about everything, but there are some communities that they still go by the Rambam. Maimonides said so. I would hold the Mishneh Torah and said, sorry, this is what my community goes. We go by the Rambam. Who also went by the Rambam most of the time is the Shulchan Aruch, Rabbi Yosef Karo, about 300 years later in the 1500s, is going to write the Shulchan Aruch, the major book of halacha to this day. Nothing has been written that supersedes that. A lot of people go after the Maran, especially the Sephardic world. That's how they call Yosef Karo, Maran. And we go after him, and this is the opinion. I have a topic here at the very end that we're going to talk about how Jewish law actually works. So that there is a traditional understanding that Rabbi so-and-so said so, this is the end of the conversation. And in some communities, that's true. In some communities, it is true that their rabbi said so, this is the end of the conversation. And in some others, this is exactly the end of the conversation, but because I'm going to do exactly the opposite of what the rabbi is saying, right? That's also a very good Jewish response to that. And some of them keep the debate alive and give autonomy to each person. There's also a text about that here. So good hint, but I want to cover a little bit more of technical sources until we get there. So life potential, another important concept for us to have in mind, number 8. There, I'm not going to read through the text, just explain that here they're discussing a woman is having challenges in the moment of giving birth. This happens on Shabbat. And there is an understanding that she's probably going to die, but there is a chance of saving the fetus. How would you do that in that time? A C-section, you need a knife, cut through the belly, take the fetus out. What's the problem? Now we all have knives everywhere. It's not that common 2,000 years ago that we had knives just hanging around. So the question is, what if we don't have a knife? Can we carry that knife on Shabbat? This is a Shabbat prohibition. We can't just desecrate Shabbat because we want to. There has to be a reason for that. And this text is going to say that it's okay, that to save the potential of life of the fetus, we can carry the knife in the public domain because this is something important. this is a text that is going to teach us that while we have seen that there is a difference between the fetus as potential of life and the mother as actual life, there is a huge value into that potential of life. We don't take that lightly. We even desecrate Shabbat to try to save it. So what we're going to see is that nothing is clear-cut, that there is always a decision to be made. And we learn from these stories that the values behind them and how to apply those values in each situation. The next text that goes in that direction, that is one of the most famous, is the one that Rashi was hinting on early on, comes from the Mishnah, and says that there is a woman having trouble also in the moment of giving birth. And if the fetus is the one that is causing the trouble and has not come out yet, she might die. They can do an abortion. This is the classic source that everyone is going to quote, source number 9, Mishnah Oholot, that permits that to happen. And this is going to be codified into the Rambam, Shulchan Aruch, and so on. This is one of those texts that's really going to be carried through that. And Rabbi Rutemar analyzes that in saying that the adult's life, the mother's life, takes precedence over the fetus life. That while we just saw in the previous text that the potential of life is important, the life takes precedence over that potential for life.
And is this only if the head hasn't come through?
Yes, because while there is a disagreement about up until that moment, everyone agrees, and that's crazy for Jews, everyone agrees that after that moment, there is life. And then, Ein dochin nefesh mipnei nefesh, that's the quote that Rashi had up there, the source of it. So because of it, after that moment, nothing we can do. There is a very interesting teshuvah, a response, a modern writing about that in-between moment and what they call half abortion in some medical circles, that there is a teshuvah about that. I did not have the knowledge nor the time to go deep into that to understand what exactly they're dealing with to bring to this space. So I decided for us to stay in this big picture with that, trying to have a clear cut about that moment. And of course, in another moment, we can look into the details, some of the experts that did more work on that. And here, Sylvia, I'm gonna get you a new language for what you're looking for. And we're gonna call it a rodif. A rodif, from the same concept of rodif shalom, the synagogue down the street. Rodif shalom is the pursuer of peace, right? So rodif is the pursuer of something. So here is a very interesting case. Here's the Rambam in the Mishneh Torah talking about this topic. So he's talking about this unique mitzvah that we should not take pity on taking the life of a rodif. Who is a rodif? Is the one who is pursuing another person to kill that person. So rodif is the shortening of an expression, and which means pursuer in order to kill, right? So if you see someone is chasing after someone else, and you see that they have a gun that they're gonna kill, they're saying, I'm gonna kill you, they're giving all the information about that, you take that person down as self-defense, is protecting the other. And what the Rambam is teaching here, you have to take no pity in taking the life of that rodif. And that's not an easy mitzvah. It's still a life. It's still someone that, for whatever challenges of life, took them to that point. But then they understand that it's kind of either one or the other. And then there is a mitzvah to make that decision. Based on that discussion, the Rambam is going to say that when the fetus is acting as a rodif, you not may, but must kill the fetus. Meaning, if the fetus is what is causing the death of the mother, like the rodif is chasing someone in order to kill, it is actually mandatory to end that pregnancy. And whenever we talk about the public political debate about that and discussions about freedom of religion and many other things, and some people say that Judaism allows abortion. There are cases where Judaism requires abortion. And whenever the fetus is acting as a rodif, that's the technical halachic term that we understand that is one of the cases. We're not even talking about the moment of childbirth. We're talking even before that, during pregnancy. If that fetus is clearly acting in a way that is gonna end the mother's life, it is our obligation to have an abortion to protect the mother's life. Questions or comments so far?
Rob, Natan, do you know from a Christian perspective if that aligns, or did they, like, what do Christians think about this part?
So I'm not a specialist there.
Yeah,
but
sorry.
And many Christian groups will have also similar but different approaches to that. The major question is when life starts, that we're talking earlier today. And they will understand, and I said that last Shabbat because one of the quotes they used for that was on the Haftorah from last Shabbat, from Prophet Jeremiah. Chapter 1 of Prophet Jeremiah said that God has chosen him to be a prophet while he was still in the womb of his mother. So the Christian understanding of that is, how could God choose Jeremiah to be a prophet if there is no life in there? So I mentioned that Saturday as a marketing piece for people to come tonight. Hope some of you who are here came because of that. That this is one of the key sources that they use, and exactly because it comes from the Hebrew Bible, they call the Old Testament. They are astonished many times when we disagree with that. Because no, that's the part we agree about, right? Don't you know about Jeremiah? And like, yeah, that's your reading of that. The same way that we discussed about the Septuagint translation earlier, that is also from the Hebrew Bible. So some of the sources that they use to make that decision comes from sources that we share. But we have a different approach to these texts, and therefore the outcomes are a little bit different. Anyone else?
I have a question again.
Yes.
So the Rambam was a doctor, correct?
To whatever they considered a doctor at that time, yes.
So I'm wondering if he was very practical, because that's what he saw. He saw women having trouble going through 9 months. And if he saw someone, I'm asking, is there any validity or any thought of that because he would be a doctor, he would see things and be more practical?
I don't know enough of the Rambam and his medical career to make that assumption, but I agree with the logic of your presenting. If anyone read the book or watched the movie, the physician, I think is the name, and talks about it's a group of Christians and Muslims, and the Christians see that the Muslims are far ahead in science because they allow for looking at the bodies after death, while Jews and Christians in general don't. And you see how different than what we consider medicine is nowadays. That's more like the kind of doctor that Rambam was. He lived in the 11th and 12th century, right? So whatever medicine was back then, that's more or less what he knew about that. Andy.
Well, just a comment on that. Probably Steve is more appropriate to mention it. I mean, the Rambam wrote a number of medical textbooks, and he was rabbi to the whatever the I forget the name of Egypt, the leader of Egypt, the king of Egypt, or whatever. So he wasn't just an ordinary doctor.
He was definitely not just an ordinary doctor, but doctors in the 11th century is different than what we now call doctors. That's maybe what I'm trying to say.
Of course.
Just curious on this, did Rambam ever take an opinion on that 40-day rule that you were talking about before?
Probably yes, since he wrote about almost literally everything. I don't have right at hand here what he says, but I can do some research and see if I can find anything about that for you later. There is now, we're going to make a quick switch on the kind of texts that we're going to be looking at. So up until now, what I shared is Torah, then Talmud, and that what we're going to consider the Rishonim. Rishonim means the first ones, are those classic rabbis from Rashi to the Ramban and so on that lived in the early medieval period. The texts that come after number 11 is a different kind of Jewish text. This is what we call Shut, which is the shortening of She'elot u Teshuvot, which is also known as questions and answers, or sometimes just as Teshuvot or Tshuva, an answer from a rabbi. So in the conversation we're having before about Jewish texts being more pluralistic in the time of the Talmud, the time of the Rishonim was a time of converging a little bit, where many of them try to summarize in one unique or maybe two options kind of positions, right? The more narrow path of what Jewish law looks like. And even if now is expensive to publish a book, remember that until the 1500s, there was no books, right? We're talking about manuscripts. So imagine that the Rambam wrote the Mishneh Torah, how many copies of those were available, how hard was to make a copy, and how long would take for something like that to be created. So after some of those codes, and they are wonderful, like works of art, of knowledge that is unbelievable how these rabbis could put together at that time. This is not the kind of literature that people could still keep writing new codes. It's not useful, it's not smart, it's not even good financially speaking. So what naturally is going to be a natural development of Jewish law in that moment, this sense of shoot, the Shelot to Tshuvot, the answers, are going to come just about topics that we don't know. If it's a clear-cut answer, just check the Shulchan Aruch, just check the Rambam, the answer is there. If it's something that they didn't write about, let's just write about that little thing. We don't need to put the entire book back again. So in that development, we're going to see a different kind of literature, and we're going to start seeing more unique cases, because up until then, it had to be written in the form of klal, of general principles, of general rulings that would apply broadly to a lot of things and have some more detailed explanation about things that they could think about beforehand, things that they had experience with, things that they had a hint from the Talmud into, and so on. And then there will be, but wait, I have this very interesting case. When the husband was actually married, and you start like telling that whole story, like, oh, that's very unique. I need to put things together from multiple places. That is what I'm going to create the Teshuvot. So there are many of them that I put here. I want to mention first some of the Tzitz Eliezer, starting from number 12. The Tzitz Eliezer, Rabbi Eliezer Yehuda Waldenberg, lived in the past century in Israel, and he was a medical advisor, a rabbinical advisor in medical teams for many very important hospitals in Israel. He wrote significantly about many medical issues. And in some ways, surprisingly very lenient. In the Orthodox world, he's very well acclaimed, and a lot of people are surprised about how lenient, how permissive he was in some of his positions. I think the major hospital he worked with is Shaarei Tzedek in Jerusalem, if I'm not mistaken, giving ethical Jewish guidance to the medical teams making in that process. So since I already read a lot and said a lot, I want someone to read for us one of his Tshuvot. Is number 12. It's one paragraph that he's writing, and he's writing not too long ago. This is from 1978. Who can read number 12 for us? Yes, Ruth Ann, please.
It is clear and obvious as law that a Jew is not killed for a fetus. Aside from one view, the authorities rule that there is a prohibition, but many authorities believe that this prohibition is rabbinic, or it is under, quote, building the world, unquote. But there is no concern for destroying a life, and therefore, Macharit 1, I can't read it, 97 to 99, permits arrangement for a Jewish woman to abort a fetus where it is needed for the mother's health, even without it being a matter of saving the mother's life. And in such a case, and beyond this, Rabbi Yaakov Emden permitted writing, quote, and even with a legitimate fetus, there is room to be lenient for great need, so long as it has not been uprooted for birth. Oops, sorry. Must not been uprooted for birth, even without a need to save the mother's life, but only to save her from her evil, which causes her great pain, unquote. We see clearly that this permission of Rabbi Yaakov Emden is even when it is not a matter of saving the mother's life, and it is only to save her from great pain because of the child, and that in general there is room to be lenient for great need, and suffering and emotional pain in great measure are greater and more painful than physical pain.
Thank you so much for reading this. What we're gonna see shifting in that conversation is the meaning of the mother's life. I think up until now, the understanding, especially that, remember, it's a bunch of men talking about women. The women were not writing or discussing any of that until then. There was no discussion about mental health, about emotional health, about spiritual health. We're talking about, is the fetus about to literally kill that woman? That's the conversation we're having so far. Based on all these sources that we read and many others, the Tzitz Eliezer is going to understand that it's clear and obvious that a Jew is not killed for a fetus. I think that's what he's saying, is that the mother takes precedence over the fetus, right? And they say that there is a prohibition to having an abortion. He quotes that there is a prohibition about abortion, but that prohibition about abortion is understood by him as rabbinic. And here we need a parenthesis on, again, understanding a little bit the big picture about Jewish law, which is there are some commandments we call deoraita, meaning in Aramaic from the Torah, and some commandments that we consider to be derabanan, meaning from the rabbis. And there is a very important concept that links these two, which is deoraita lechumra, derabanan lekula. Anything that we consider to be from the Torah law, we rule more stringently. So we have to be more stringent. So we cannot just like, yeah, I'm not feeling like this thing on Shabbat, like I'm just gonna do it. No, Shabbat, keeping Shabbat is the right thing. It's from the Torah. You can't just make that decision like be lenient. Everything is to protect Shabbat. Everything is to protect Torah law. But if there is a prohibition that is rabbinic, we must rule leniently. That's a concept. Anything that is considered by the rabbis as the Rabbanan, whenever a rabbi is looking at the sources and making that possible, we make it lekula. We make a more lenient decision. This is across the board. This is since the times of the Talmud. Every posek, every decisive rabbi knows this concept. So understanding the prohibition for abortion here as rabbinic is key for his argument. And that might be the difference that other rabbis might approach and might say there's nothing I can do, is because they might understand the prohibition for abortion, even in other cases, as Deoraita, as from the Torah. And there they cannot be more lenient about that. So how you define that prohibition in many cases is key for how we understand something like that. Another day I can talk about many other examples that we know about that decision. Is that Deoraita? Is that the Rabbanan changed completely how you understand something? One of the most famous ones that no one knows that that's the root of the challenge is the tshuva about driving to the synagogue on Shabbat. The conservative movement understood by a minority opinion of the Tosfot that there is one specific thing that is the Rabbanan. Therefore, we can rule leniently. If they don't understand that based on the Tosfot about that, forget it. We cannot do it. So many times a more lenient position is going to come from that understanding that the prohibition to it is the Rabbanan. It's from the rabbis and not the right. And here he's going to be for sure in the Orthodox world, but even outside of the Orthodox world, very new to this idea that mental health, emotional health, and spiritual health are reasons for an abortion from a religious perspective. In that sense, as we're talking earlier, that there are moments that there is a requirement for an abortion when the physical life of the mother is at stake. This is going to be in that gray area of when it's permitted but not required, because there's a lot of evaluation that needs to go in by that person, by the medical team and psychologists and so on, to help that person make that decision in that moment. So it doesn't mean that Judaism forbids the mother having a choice based on other elements, but there is a permission that needs to be taken seriously and cautiously whenever to be used. Because it's not like, yeah, just make your decision. No, there is a rabbinic prohibition. There is. And it's important, I think, for us to understand. There is a rabbinic prohibition. What the Tzitz Eliezer is allowing is that prohibition is rabbinic, and therefore it can be lenient if there are competing values, competing elements. So this is not a blank statement or permission for any kind of abortion, rather a narrow permission for some cases. And that's the approach that he's taking. Questions or comments?
Question.
Yes, Ken.
I'm listening to your whole discussion from the point of view that this whole question about what Judaism permits could end up in front of the Florida Supreme Court, because this is being tested in Florida in a lawsuit. And when this gets into a court of law, there'll be some question of what is the Jewish rule, what's the authority, and so on. The rabbi that you just quoted, who the more recent one, writing in the 1970s, I think he said, how authoritative is he? For instance, we're hearing this from you tonight. If we were having this class, say, in a synagogue with a Chabad leader, would he be giving us the same kind of modern, nuanced view? How would this hold up?
So I love your question, Ken, because we're going to skip to source 15. Tzitz Eliezer is definitely what we consider a Gadol Hador, a great of the generation. The Tzitz Eliezer is well known anywhere, any stream of Judaism. If you don't know the Tzitz Eliezer, you don't know enough about Judaism. It's not that he's not great enough. Okay, let's put things in perspective. He is one of the great ones of his generations for sure. And number 15 is Igrot Moshe, another Gadolador, another great of this generation, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, especially in the United States, in New York, one of the major poskim, the major halachic decisors in the Orthodox world. So he's responding to the Tzitz Eliezer. The fact that Rabbi Moshe Feinstein has to say something about what Tzitz Eliezer said means how great Tzitz Eliezer is, right? So it does stand to that point. And look how he talks about this. So we're on number 15. And look the language that Rabbi Moshe Feinstein uses as well. So this is an excerpt from one of his teshuvot from 76. So the teshuva we read from the Tzitz Eliezer is from 78. So he probably has said something like it before an earlier time, because my understanding is that he is the one that is being quoted here by Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, because the Tzitz Eliezer wrote earlier on, so we just read something he wrote in 78. Earlier on, he wrote something about Tay-Sachs abortion. And that was probably the most challenging and the first one, I think, that he wrote about the topic chronologically, allowing that when it's known that the fetus has Tay-Sachs, that abortion is allowed. So Rabbi Moshe Feinstein is responding to that Tay-Sachs tshuva in particular. So he said, regarding killing a fetus, the Rambam is even more explicit that killing a fetus is actual murder. Therefore, regarding the law, is prohibited under the prohibition of thou shalt not murder, shall abort a fetus. So again, he's making here that is the oraita, that this is a biblical prohibition. He's putting that into the 10 commandments, that killing a fetus, and he's using the word killing, right, on purpose, to pair that with abortion and killing. And because of this, I ruled that even if the doctors are saying that there is a possibility that the mother may die if the fetus is not killed, although for desecrating Shabbat and violating other commandments, one would do so in such case, even for a small concern of life, nevertheless, to kill fetus it would be forbidden until the doctors assess the likelihood of her death is almost definite. So he's gonna take the reading of that earlier Mishnah that we said, that if she's at the moment of childbirth, really like in the moment, and you have to make an executive decision, only and only then is permissive. It's really when really she's about to die if you don't do that. So he's way more narrow into that permission that he's even framing as a prohibition, right? He's not framing as a permission to abort in certain cases. He's starting from saying it's completely forbidden. There is the exception when it can actually be done. But I want then to jump to the talk where he talks about, I have written all this because of great calamity in the world, that many governments have allowed the killing of fetuses. Among them, political leaders in the state of Israel, and countless of fetuses have already been killed. And these days, the greatest need is to make fence around the Torah. That's a classic wording on the Orthodox in general, by Moshe Feinstein in particular, right? We need to put more prohibitions around the Torah so we don't come to the actual issue. How much more so to make leniencies regarding the prohibition of murder that is so severe. Thus, I was appalled by the response of a learned man in Israel to the director of Shaarei Tzedek Hospital, who permits abortion of a Tay-Sachs fetus even beyond 3 months. And he ruled such by prefacing that the prohibition was, according to many decisors, only rabbinic. So again, that's the core disagreement of that, is where that prohibition comes from. What's the source? It is clear and simple as I wrote, the law which is made clear by the early rabbis and the decisors of Jewish law, that abortion is prohibited and is considered actual murder, whether the fetus is legitimate or illegitimate. There are a lot of discussions about rape, about a married woman, and so on. Regular fetuses are those who are suffering from Tay-Sachs, is strictly prohibited and do not err and rely on the response of that learned man. Even when he criticizes the tzitz Eliezer or others who are part of that team, might not be him personally here, but maybe part of that group that he was a part of, he's calling them a learned man.
Learned.
Right? So I think it's very interesting to put into perspective how two great poskim rabbis of their generation can still respect each other while disagreeing so much about really matters of life and death. Any questions so far? Comments?
Yes, Rabbi
Yes, please.
Martin. So the interpretation that you had that allowed for abortion took into account the fact that women, you were more liberal because it was a rabbinical law, and you were more liberal doing the abortion for the woman, but you were not more liberal to the fetus, who was interpreted as a life. By doing the abortion, you're killing the baby. So your interpretation of being liberal really is favoring one group and not the other. So I don't see that you're being liberal. I think that you're intentionally favoring one rather than the other, where I think there's not much discussion that the fetus or the baby after 3 months or 40 days is a viable life.
So Marty, let me share a couple of things from what you just shared. First, I'm not going for any position this or that. I'm sharing with you the sources and sharing with you who said each thing. I'm not saying anything.
No, I didn't mean that it was you. I mean, his interpretation,
Yes.
the in Israel was interpreting the liberalization.
Yes. So let me share a couple more things. You also said that that was a more liberal interpretation. No, I said lenient. Lenient is a technical term about Jewish law that, as I explained earlier, we're commanded to, if that is understood as a rabbinic prohibition, we must rule leniently, not liberally. We're not talking about even what liberal means, that it can mean many things differently. And we're not ruling leniently towards the mother or towards the fetus. We're not taking sides here. Whether we're doing leniently with the law, with how Jewish law is being understood here, right? We approach law with a lenient perspective to allow something that is understood to be the best outcome. And in that sense, yes, there is a favor over the woman's life over the fetus life. And that's the earlier sources about there is a clear difference of a potential to life, which is the fetus, and a life, which is the mother. So when ruling leniently in that size, it does mean favoring the certainty of the life of the woman versus the potential of life that is understood to be the fetus. So that's how this is being applied here. So there is a difference. I think some of the earlier sources that we cover really shared that the fetus has no higher right to live over the mother's right to live. And this is key, I think, to understanding the Jewish perspective into that while I shared one interesting text from the Talmud that has a different take on it, is going to be the clear cut across the board for the past 2,000 years that Judaism understands that as a difference, that the fetus is a potential to life, while the mother is a real life. Later on, I can hint a little bit, if I have some time, on the idea of the viable, the times and all of that, but also there's so much we can cover, and I want to prioritize on some other things that I think are more interesting, but you have a diagram at the very end that talks in very unique halachic coding about some of these times and what they mean. Does that help answer your question?
Yes, lenient, except we're equating life of the mother and life of the fetus, but we're not equating health of the mother or psychologic well-being versus the physical life of the fetus.
In the case of
Whereas I agree
And-
completely if that the life of the mother is more valuable than the life of the fetus. But now you get to be nuanced, as you said, by destroying the fetus, you're destroying the life by
You don't know that.
So
possibly
let,
entering.
let Marty finish and please let me allow everyone to speak at the right moment.
Right. The doctor in Israel was getting much more nuanced. He equating psychological benefit and health benefit to physical life. That's where I saw that there was a little bit of a favoritism towards one of the two parties.
So Marty, what I think that you try to equate again, and I want to make sure that you understand the concept, is that whenever we're talking about the fetus, we're not talking about life. We're talking about potential of life. And that's important when we explain that whenever we're equating, even if we're talking about other kinds of life and spiritual and mental and emotional health of the mother, this is still being equated to a potential of life, never equating with the life of the fetus, because the Jewish understanding is that there is no life in the fetus, there is a potential for life. And this is exactly his argument that I just shared with you, that there is another rabbi that disagrees with that, which is Moshe Feinstein. And if you, on your personal life, want to go with that, you have Rabbi Moshe Feinstein to rely on, and it's a great perspective to rely on. And others can also rely on the Tzitz Eliezer if they see fit, because it's also a great option to rely on. So that's exactly what I'm trying to present here, that those options exist, and and it really comes to the root of the question about if you understand that rabbinic or Torah law. And if you are rabbinic, it gives you the space for leniency in understanding the elements you have at play. And then I think Silvia has something to share, and Ruth Ann has something to share.
So far, anyway, my takeaway from our entire discussion is that with a few narrow exceptions, the decision to abort a fetus is entirely the mother's. As I said, with all the nuances that we've discovered, the one thing that either I missed the discussion of it because I was walking back and forth, or maybe you didn't address it, was way back earlier when, in the case of an adulterous woman who was pregnant, there was no indication in that explanation or that, I guess, discussion where it says something, whether the fetus was that of the husband or the lover.
I did
So-
not cover that because that's a topic in itself, and is a very misogynistic topic because most of the rulings are going to be talking about the fetus as property of the husband, and they don't like that kind of language. So I wanted to focus on first the 101, the big picture, let's say the most plain case, and then an adulterous woman, that many of the rulings are going to be different than what we would imagine, because the fetus is understood as property of the husband and not the wife. And there's a whole nother conversation that we need to have that is more challenging when we're talking about adulterous women. That is one of the major reasons for the rabbis to discuss abortion in the early stages.
That's very difficult, especially because in the case of an adulterous woman, according to Torah, she has to be tested as to whether or not she
So
really,
we're not even gonna
Yeah.
get there, Sylvia.
So,
This is not the topic
so that
for
makes
tonight.
it doubly difficult. Yeah.
Ruth Ann.
Question of the suffering of a Tay-Sachs baby. Because that doesn't even come up, but to give birth to a child who will suffer, I mean, we don't know how to bring value to the life. not to mention the suffering of the family trying to care for a Tay-Sachs baby. But that doesn't come in here at all in terms of his saying, even in the case of Tay-Sachs, it would be murder.
So I did not bring the original from the Tzitz Eliezer, where he rules that it's okay to have an abortion in that case. I can try to find the text about that and send you if you want. He does deal with more in detail about the emotional and the challenges of the family in that sense, and that's what's gonna allow him to be lenient in that perspective and allow that kind of abortion.
But for Feinstein, that he never goes there, right?
In part, he can't, because in understanding the way he understands the Rambam, he must rule stringently. Like, and that's part of why I'm really hinting on that key different understanding. One there's this in rabbinic, he can even have that conversation. One understand that this is Torah law, this is murder, I'm not even going to entertain that idea. Right? So that's part of the root of both opinions that we're seeing here. We're getting to the hour, and I want to just maybe take 5 more minutes to show what is in that collection of sources that I brought to you, and then come to a conclusion of our learning for tonight. I brought to you source number 17, which is a view from Reform Judaism. Why I'm bringing this? Because this whole conversation we had about this is the Oraita, this is from the Torah, this is the Rabbanan, this is from the rabbis. From a Reform Judaism perspective, the way they approach law, this is not important. The individual is entitled to their sole discretion to make any decision. Why is this important on the bigger debate we're talking about abortion? That is totally okay for a Reformed Jew to say, I, in my understanding of Judaism, without quoting any rabbi or any scripture or anything, understand that according to my religion, I'm entitled to do so. And I have a religious right to profess my religion. And Reform Judaism is as legitimate as any other stream of Judaism. So I think it's important for us to understand that whenever we're talking about Judaism, while I tend to stay within the realms of traditional halakha, that I'm going to call this way, as a normative or prescriptive perspective to Judaism, not every Jew understands Jewish law in the same sense, and they still have the right of religion assured to them as well. So I just wanted to bring that perspective, and Rabbi Alvin Rises in the 1990 wrote a little bit about that, and he has a very interesting text that explains that a little bit more. Yes, Ken?
Does the conservative movement have a viewpoint on this?
Next page. So the conservative movement, when they had that discussion in 1983, I think there were 5 teshuvot that were published because they couldn't agree on anything. So it's classic conservative movement. It couldn't be different, right? If anyone is expecting anything like that. I did not go deep into all of them. I did look into Rabbi Isaac Klein's tshuva because he is one of the Gedol Hador for the conservative movement. Really wrote one of the books I have here in my shelf as a source for Jewish law, very knowledgeable. And just the structure of his tshuva was not ideal for me to bring into that source. I'll just read one quote from him that I bring here. He says, our conclusion, therefore, must be that abortion is morally wrong. It should be permitted only for therapeutic reasons. So this is, I'm going to post his tshuva if anyone wants to go deeper into that from Isaac Klein, one of the major voices of the conservative movement. This tshuva what he wrote in 59 was approved in 83 with 11 votes in favor, 1 against, and 5 abstaining. At that time, they were 17 voting members. This is the final punchline that he has, which I think is very interesting because he brings morality, and we're going to have to read the 8 pages that he wrote about that to understand how he's getting to that position about morality. And still, there are reasons to be permitted. Right.
Find therapeutic.
Exactly. And then we're also going to have to go deeper later and understand what he means by therapeutic. So I wanted to bring another quick answer from the conservative movement, from the same debate, from the same time, Rabbi Robert Gordis, also a great one in the conservative movement, very key member in putting together the Emet V'Emunah, which was the declaration of principles of the conservative movement. And he says, source 18, obviously there can be no totally satisfactory solution to the abortion problem, which is itself a symptom of a tragedy. The choice of the lesser of two evils must be the goal in guiding society to a rational decision. Robert Gordis is very geared to our rational decisions. This is part of his approach. So long as we must depend upon a legal system rather than upon the human conscience to enforce an ethical code, it is clear that the best solution lies in preserving a basically liberal attitude towards abortion with conservative safeguards. So liberal attitude towards abortion with conservative safeguards, checks and balances with that permission. This is to say, proper facilities for an abortion should be generally available to all classes of the population, while precautionary procedures must be established in special cases. So it's interesting that he has a social perspective, that there is a need for that to be permitted and allowed in the country to be safe, while he is probably hoping that those facilities are just going to be a problem to our banks and will never be used. While he doesn't want them to be used, there is a moral understanding on his end that it should be available for whenever there is a need to be used, which I think is a very interesting of the approach of the conservative movement and how it brings some of those things together. There's a lot more for us to cover, but I just want to show and explain what number 20 is at the very end. This is an excerpt from a text written by Rabbi Aaron Alexander, who is now one of the senior rabbis at Adas Yisrael in DC and my halacha teacher. And he wrote this text that he calls How Jewish Law Actually Works. And he tries to propose an understanding that I think is very pertinent to how we in the conservative movement understand Jewish law, and that usually we have some orthodox conceptions of Jewish law that we're trying to apply in the conservative movement. So he talks about two major parts of Jewish law: prohibitions and obligations. This is the core of any law system: obligations, prohibitions. But then I think what is unique about the way he explains it, not he's the first one necessarily saying it, because I think this is part of what halacha has always been, but he clearly explains that at the very end of the first paragraph. He talks about values, legal principles, consequences, and reality. And what he says clearly here that is, I think, is important, he says, none of them is extra to the system, rather they are part of the system. We have a tendency to understand that the system is obligation and prohibition, and then, oh, those values here to trouble are apart from the outside. No, he explains that those values, those principles, those consequences, those reality, this is how halacha is lived. Halacha is a way of living our lives. And all of this is part of the system. We can't just rule excuse me, about one single topic in the clouds, but we need to rule about that, bringing together those values as indicators, as modifiers of those prohibitions and obligations, as part of the system, not as outsiders, but as part of the system. So a couple examples that he brings. One is kavod habriot, human dignity. There is no mitzvah of human dignity. There is no way for you to say, here, I check my box, I made kiddush on Shabbat, and I performed human dignity. There is no checkbox for human dignity. There is no one way to do that. Rather, this is a value that should apply throughout all the obligations and prohibitions. Another very famous one that we talk about all the time is tikkun olam. Tikkun Olam is not a mitzvah. You don't have to do Tikkun Olam. Tikkun Olam is not what now we call social action, almost as synonyms. That's not how Jewish law understands Tikkun Olam. But rather, Tikkun Olam is a value within the system that's sometimes going to say we should go this way, but because of Tikkun Olam, we're going to make that decision. One of the major examples is to prevent agunot, when a woman is chained, aguna, to her husband and can't get a divorce. For Tikkun Olam, fixing the word, fixing the system, we can allow some things that the obligation, the prohibition was going this way, Tikkun Olam makes it go this way. Consequences, what is the consequence, the potential outcomes of that decision, and this being grounded in reality. So whenever we are discussing any topic from a modern perspective, I really like bringing this perspective that Rabbi Alexander brings, because sometimes, as I started our conversation today, the answer that a lot of people are going to say, but it's written in the Torah, right? And it's like, yeah, it is. I just showed you exactly what it is and what it's not. And whenever we're making a halachic ruling, all this teshuvot that I brought you, I brought a paragraph. These people are writing 10 and 20 pages, valuing the values that come to play, the consequences, the reality as they understand. And look at that. The way one rabbi understands the reality might change the outcome of that decision. Because if reality is an integral part of the system, it really changes how we understand the elements at play that are also part of the system. So my goal for today was to bring some of the most original sources, key sources that are part of this conversation, and share with you also the complexity and some of the elements that are at play in making the decision, and how, as an outcome of that complexity, we have opposite, and not necessarily opposite, but completely different frameworks sometimes, as we talked about the Reform movement, for example, that are grounds for people make religious decisions about this topic that they are entitled to also as religious people. And they might be very different. And I will be here supporting the right for each one of them to do what they want to do or not do what they don't want to do, but not to have anyone preventing any of them to follow their religious understanding of any topic. I'm going to end our class for today here at this moment. And